Hi again. In the defined frame with me, Aslam Kakar. Today, I want to talk about this very interesting concept, which I call the double suffering of the oppressed. Um, what I mean by the double is that there are two kinds of suffering in life that human beings, as individuals and as groups and collectivities, go through. One is what I call existential suffering, which comes or arises from us existing as human beings in this universe or in life. And I don't mean existential in the sense of existentialist philosophy or philosophical idea, which Sartre and others talked about extensively, wrote about extensively. This notion of freedom and responsibility and authenticity, authentic existence, right? With freedom and responsibility. But I don't mean it in that sense. What I mean by existential is simply, existing, or that which arises out of existence. So there is death, there is pain, there is injuries, there is illness, right? Which we experience because we exist. Everybody, every tall, short, big, small, black, white, Punjabi, Baloch, Pashtuns, women, men, everybody. I mean, in trans people, everyone experiences suffering, right? Um, and so then, because they exist, but then there is another kind of suffering or pain that comes from the fact that we exist as particular individuals, as particular um, collectivities in particular systems, right? So for the Baloch, there is, for example, the double suffering. One is the pain that everybody goes through. Then there is, on top of that, more pain and more suffering because the Baloch exist as a group in Pakistan, which is a particular state with a particular set of ideas and rules and which, if you were to know and curious about my view, is that it is just another form of internal colonialism, right? The Baloch for the Baloch, that is the experience as the oppressed people in a structure which treats them subhumans and actually less humans, and which is why then there are policies of violence and justified on this understanding, and which comes from social distance, and right. So anyway, so for the Baloch, for example, there is existential suffering, but then there is on top of that structural suffering because they exist as particular individuals and as a particular group in a particular system, which is horrible towards them, right? And you can say the same about black people. You can say the same about women. You can say the same about trans people, right? You can say the same about, I mean, so many other groups which are oppressed, and that is why we call them oppressed. So the idea that I am developing in a longer essay is that there is this thing called the double suffering of the oppressed. Every time the oppressed talk about their structural suffering, the oppressor or the supporters of the oppressor tell them, oh, we suffer too. For example, Pashtuns have said in the war on terror, it is true that over 70,000 people have been killed, right, by both non-state actors and the state during military operations targeting the non-state actors, such as the Taliban. But when Pashtuns say, I mean, there is actual data on, uh, for example, from 2006 to 2015, 16, some, like South Asia Terrorism Portal, for example, has shown that close to 82% of casualties have taken place in places like Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and the tribal areas, right? Of course, most Pakistanis, a lot of Pakistanis suffered, but some groups suffered more than others. And so, and that is just one example, right? So you can, I mean, the Pashtun Jirga had similar numbers. So you can go on and look at different sources. Most of terrorist violence happened in these areas, right? And not to add, I mean, and to mention economic underdevelopment and, I mean, poverty and, I mean, Kalabdulais, for example, the poorest um, district. The last time I checked. So there is, and to avoid going into the details, I want us to come back to the central contention here, which is this idea of double suffering, right? Structural suffering and existential suffering. So every time the oppressed bring up structural suffering, they're countered with suffering, but existential suffering mostly, but then also there are gradations of like structural suffering. And I should also say here that sometimes the line between the structural suffering and the existential suffering is not quite clear. But there are ways to clarify those confusions or this zone of blurredness, right? That I call it zone of ontological or epistemic blurredness. And a lot of times it is systematic. I mean, the state has kept a narrative that through false equivalences and through this conflation of like particular identities into one larger uh, mythical national identity and so on, has maintained this blurredness, right? For the public, it's probably unintentional, but for the state, which has so much at its disposal, the blurredness, I don't disbelieve, is systemically, and it is maintained that through the media, through educational apparatus, through its ideology, and through, of course, use of violence when you question that blurredness, right? Um, so I will be developing this in a longer essay in the days and weeks to come. But the idea here, to wrap it up, is that look, there are two kinds of sufferings: existential suffering and structural suffering. We all exist. We all suffer because we exist. But some people suffer more, not because only of their existence, but also of their existence as particular individuals and groups in societies, existing in particular societies. Um, and so that distinction is really important, because both for the oppressed and the oppressor, for the oppressed, because the oppressed need to know the source of their suffering, their pain, and their misery, which is caused by structures. I've heard many, many, many times after suicide attacks and blasts and people dying, and they were called, martyrs. And people have at this point accepted structural suffering as some kind of unavoidable, inevitable existential reality. But the reality is that that's not true, and that needs to be clarified, and that needs to be understood in ways that are, I think, more scientifically orientated and more intentional and more empirical and also theoretical or philosophical, whatever you call it. But this is the intervention that needs to. I'm sure people have done it already, but I haven't heard in the ways I'm trying to articulate that this double suffering of existence and structure, and we shouldn't, even if it is hard to find this line of demarcation always. It is important to find it. And that will be something I'll be hashing out. I mean, it will of course take a lot more effort, but that is the idea that existential and the risk of repeating and structural, that zone of blurredness has to be addressed, and people, the oppressor, has to know that that and actually you know foster some empathy for the oppressed, right? By identifying that this thing is happening because of particular policies and structures and ideologies and institutions, not because these people just exist. No, they exist and they are going through that pain too, but you're imposing on top of that another layer of pain and endless suffering, right? And that over time probably turns for them into like, okay, this is our reality, this is our existence, this is like unalterable. This is what it is. We got to just live through it. But for the oppressed, they have to understand that no, structural suffering is not existential suffering. They can have a better life as a people, as a group, as a collectivity, right? And this needs to be, again, as I say, front and center of the conversation on, on terrorism, on violence, on ethnic conflict, on ways to mitigate, on ways to address. Like this is important for both parties to understand. I hope that makes sense, and hope to see you in my next episode. Thank you for listening. And yes, don't forget to subscribe if you're interested in listening to more of these kinds of, I think, thoughts, which I call the defined view within the defined frame, and a different frame or the defined frame. And that is my inspiration for this channel. Thank you for your support, and bye.